Good morning, everyone. We will wait for 2 more minutes until all the attendees have joined the session. So please be here with us. So we'll be very shortly. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
So good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Welcome to this parallel event on women at the helm of sustainable solutions to climate threats, hosted by DIANOVA International on the margins of the 66th Commission on the Status of Women, known as CSW 66. As you may know, we are already 1 week into CSW 66, where experts from around the world are debating on gender equality and women's empowerment on the context of climate change and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. In line with that discussion, and to give a little bit of background on the topic of this event, at DIANOVA, we understand that the effects of climate change on women's health are aggravated by gender inequality. The complex relations that exist among socioeconomic, cultural, and physiological factors, beside others, amplify gender-based vulnerabilities and health disparities as well, even more in low and middle income countries. At DIANOVA, we believe there is a need for holistic healthcare services that are also gender responsive, inclusive, and accessible to address these barriers in protecting women's health and responding to climate change. Today, I have the privilege of moderating this event in which intersections among gender equality, women's empowerment, women's health and climate change and disaster risk reduction interventions will be discussed by our excellent speakers with extensive experience in these fields. I am Victoria Espada, representative of DIANOVA International to the United Nations, and will be hearing shortly from Keka Zambasu, founder president of Green Hope Foundation and keynote speaker of this event. We'll also hear from Nick Newland, advocacy director of Associated Country Women of the World, and from Gabriel Tripura, executive director of Cothawain. We'll be hearing from Taban Shores, CEO of the Lotus Flower, and finally, we'll hear from Edward Carlson, CEO of Odyssey House Louisiana. After the speakers' interventions, there will be a time for discussion, so please, audience, feel free to put the questions you may have in the chat box. So to kick us off and to start the interventions, I'm honored to introduce you to Keka Zambasu, keynote speaker of this event. As I mentioned, Keka is an iconic global influencer, environmentalist, champion of women's rights, TED speaker, author, musician, and peace and sustainability campaigner. She's the founder of president of Green Hope Foundation, a global social innovation enterprise that works at a grassroots level in 26 countries. Also, Keka is a United Nations human rights champion, winner of the 2016 International Children's Peace Prize, one of Canada's top 25 women of influence, and co-lead of the Generation Forum Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Keka, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you for the invitation. And hello, everyone. I am delighted to share this virtual space with all of you at CSW 66 and to discuss such an important topic that I feel is still not discussed enough in mainstream discourse. So that is why I'm very happy that we have gathered here today to speak about this very, very important topic. So I will begin by sharing how 7 years ago, right to this day, I had a wonderful experience of meeting with Perveen. And Perveen is, at that time, a frail 15-year-old who looked even younger because of her frailty. And she lives with her family of 10 in a cramped hut in the vast wilderness that's known as the Run of Kutch, which are the salt pans of India, producing 70% of the country's salt, primarily through manual, painstaking labor of the indigenous people, of the indigenous communities to which Perveen belongs. And it's a very harsh, drought-stricken landscape. And every morning before the sun rises, Perveen is out trekking miles barefoot into the Run of Kutch to find firewood. So for girls like her, the trek gets longer and longer each year due to climate change-induced drought and famine and the human impacts of deforestation that are wiping out the last vestiges of greenery in that salt pan. And Perveen, like all of the other women and girls in her village, suffer from various lung diseases and other NCDs that are caused by pollution and a lack of awareness, poor nutrition, and all of the overbearing social pressures and stereotypes that the women and the girls have to suffer from every single day in their short lives, because working in the pans reduces their lifespan drastically. Now, I had met Perveen when in 2015, we had gone to distribute solar lamps to the communities that were living over there to ensure that they had a source of light at night. And that is when we learned about the lack of nutrition that existed over there, the tremendous health impacts that were there as a result of working in the pans. So a few years later, we started our solar cooker distribution campaign, where this enabled the women and girls in Perveen's village to have a sustainable source of cooking that wasn't killing them, that was climate friendly, and that also ensured that they, as migrant workers, could leave in the morning knowing that their children would be able to have a source of food instead of them going hungry throughout the day. Now, we saw how this directly had an impact on their nutrition in a positive way, because it positively impacted the food chains and the food sources. And we installed these cookers and we gave them these cookers because we saw how in their communities it was the men and boys who ate first when food was limited, which it was due to climate change induced disasters. And then we also saw how this caused them to have a lack of access to even adequate sanitation because of the lack of access to toilets. Now, what we did was we built toilets in many rural communities around the world, because we realized how climate change impacted their women and girls' lack of access to clean water and sanitation. And even though we know having a toilet is a basic human right, we often don't understand or even see how many women around the world don't have access to toilets and how climate change is exacerbating that lack of access. So for us at Green Hope Foundation, we always ensure that the context that we work in is all about ecofeminism and taking on that intersectional ecofeminist lens, where we look at the connection between human beings and nature through the intersectional gender lens. And this allows us to recognize the challenges that women face, but also recognize them as leaders in the sustainability movement who are bringing about positive change by protecting the planet, rather than just relegating them to being victims, as is the usual thought about them. And through this intersectional ecofeminist lens that we use, through our programs, we ensure that the women have sustainable sources of income where they are leading the movements. For instance, we conduct workshops for them on training for organic farming, which allows them to have a sustainable source of income. Now, in some of the communities that we work in, the women have started their own organic garden where they grow their own vegetables. We have installed solar irrigation systems that enable the women farmers to, once again, have crop that is grown locally, that is not cash crops grown by the urban environments. And it's just so amazing to see how the women and girls who have received the training on organic farming are now leading the way for the other women in their villages to have that sustainable source of income and then use that money to send their girls, especially to school. What we also noticed is that there is how climate change affects women and girls, and especially girls dropping out of school due to climate change-induced disasters. And because Green Hope Foundation uses education for sustainable development as a transformative tool for climate literacy, we have installed our solar-powered mobile libraries that take books and stationery items directly to the doorstep of over 300,000 communities and homes across Asia and Africa. And the best part is that it's led by our female ambassadors who have gone through the very same challenges and don't want their community to go through that again. We provide computer literacy for the girls especially, and it's just so amazing to see how these women and girls are now using those STEM skills to get good jobs, and their empowerment is lifting their entire community that are so climate vulnerable out of poverty. So for us at Green Hope Foundation, we understand how important it is to recognize that the possibilities for change are immense, as is clearly demonstrated by the impacts of our work. All we need to do is make sure that this recognition of women at the helm of sustainable solutions to climate threats, it's mainstreamed, it is understood. We are not just relegated to victims. And we understand that women and girls in all of our diversity have been leaders for centuries. And it's important that we move ahead with an intersectional ecofeminist lens when we're speaking about sustainable solutions to climate threats, because if we leave women behind, we will not be able to ensure climate justice or achieve sustainable development. So let us move ahead now with the recognition that women and girls have always been leaders, and it's important that their leadership role is taken into account as we work to achieve the SDGs and Agenda 2030 so that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keka, and thank you for showcasing how climate change are impacting the most vulnerable, especially women and especially young women, and how climate change intersects with health and education, among other factors. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to our first panelist, Nick Newland, Advocacy Director and Chief Privacy Officer of Associated Country Women of the World, ACWW. Nick represents ACWW as focal point at the Commission on the Status of Women and at the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, and attends meetings in a lot of bodies and commissions of the UN, FAO, the Commission of Human Rights, CEDAW, and UNESCO, to ensure that ACWW's members are heard on the international stage. Nick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and I'm really pleased to be here today and joining an esteemed panel of experts and people who have very varied experience to bring to this. Of course, following Keka is a hard act, and you know, the quickest, easiest thing I can say is she's absolutely right. You know, everything she has said tallies with ACWW's experience of working in the field, and the interconnected impacts of changing one or two things is huge, but getting societies to accept those changes is the biggest challenge, I think. But also the reflection on whether it's the impact of toilets on all of the other things that happen in a community, or whether it's the reality that the further that water is away, the less education. And there is you can see the impact on a graph. The further you walk, the less education there is to be accessed. So from ACWW's experience, it's well established that women living in remote, rural and marginal areas, whether that's mountains, drylands, deserts, agricultural areas, those with poor quality natural resources, limited communication, they always suffer the most significant impacts of climate change. And we're not talking about small numbers of people in small communities. We're talking 20 to 25% of the world's population when we talk about rural women. This is a significant number. For centuries, communities have developed some ability to survive, to mitigate impacts of changing climate. But what we've seen in the last 3, 4, 5 decades is that as that increase of intensity of climate change has accelerated, that those adaptations and mitigations that evolve naturally within communities are being overwhelmed. And when we look at the CSW theme for this year, environmental disasters, these are not future, these are happening right now. We are seeing them on a daily basis. And there's no single mitigation or adaptation that's relevant in all countries or communities. It always concerns me when we look at the drafts for things like the agreed conclusions and for CSW, and there's a theoretical, a single answer, or we must all adopt this, we must adopt one action plan. No one who knows what they're talking about will ask for anyone to adopt one single action plan globally, because no one has the expertise to do that. We have to listen to local communities, otherwise the whole thing is irrelevant. ACWW was founded in 1929 to amplify the voices of rural women so that the problems they face and the solutions they raise are heard and acknowledged by international policymakers and legislators. In 2022, the rural women continue to be the backbone of families, communities, and countries, but we're still facing systemic issues, and we still need systematic change. Could I ask whoever it is who's just joined the call to mute themselves? Perfect, thank you. Sorry. So in the last couple of years, the OECD has highlighted that although climate change policies are often targeted to specific sectors, they tend to be applied uniformly within a country. And we know that those countries are not all the same. Very few countries have the same issues in rural and urban areas. And there's very rarely significant and critical disaggregation of rurality or geographic factors. And even in the UK, when our government talks about championing disaggregated data, they cannot publish specific data on rural women because they haven't disaggregated it. Or the reality is so poor they refuse to publish it because they don't want to recognize how bad the situation is. So this means that policies, even when they're good, are really weakened by the perceived failure because people look at them as not successful because they're being applied in a way that doesn't work. So when then public funds are invested, they're diluted by this ineffective use. And so they become unpopular with people in cities, and people in cities are often the people who are most seen at the ballot box. And so that influences government policy. And there we have our fundamental problem. So when we look at negotiations on policy at international levels, we must reflect our global diversity. And governmental policies have to reflect their populations, not just as they're seen by those in privileged positions, but the reality on the ground in each country. The role played by rural women in rural communities absolutely mirrors those in urban areas. But with additional responsibilities, as Keka pulled out, agricultural workforces, informal work, demands, including water collection, provision of home, food, family education, resource management, lots of other factors. And they suffer disproportionately from multidimensional poverty. The point Keka made about solar cookers and the reality that men are often eating first, we've absolutely seen ourselves where, in the woman's view, she has to keep her husband fed because he is earning income that keeps the family alive. But without the recognition that the woman is the one keeping the entire family alive through everything else that's being done. And although we've seen this level of extreme poverty decline globally over the last 10 years, the 1 billion people who continue to be living in the worst conditions are absolutely concentrated in rural areas. In Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, small family farming agriculture accounts for about 80% of the food and supports more than 2.5 billion people. And the women in those communities are just as productive and enterprising as their male counterparts, but they're contending with far greater and more strenuous challenges. They're less able to access land, credit, agricultural inputs, markets, high-value agri-food chains. They're facing a tougher fight every day just to survive. And then when we look at the impacts on climate change, rural communities play an essential role in transition to net zero emission economies and building resilience. But it is women in these communities that are going to play the most critical role. And this is where I have always a slight problem with the term agents of change, because I think as it's perhaps conceived, it's a positive thing. But when it gets included in treaties, when it gets included in documents, when it gets thrown around as a title, it puts all of the obligation for success on the heads of women who are already most at risk of being left behind. And that's a huge burden that excuses the responsibilities of states and industries. When we look at human rights, they are the human rights that are supposed to be afforded to us by our governments. And putting the obligation for success on the women who themselves are being discriminated against is a huge additional challenge and burden. But what we do recognize is that many governments lack the knowledge, ability, and skills, and obviously in some cases funding, to manage transitional processes and adapt to climate change in a way that also respects populations. Aging populations, emigration from rural communities, widowhood, limited economic diversity, an insistence on rural and indigenous communities complying with Western capitalist economic structures, remoteness, dependent on external markets, lower quality physical and digital and legal infrastructures all exacerbate those rural vulnerabilities. And so, of course, we have to champion the incredible achievements of women globally and what is accomplished in the face of this daily intersecting and dangerous challenge. But what we also need to see is systematic changes to problematic systems. I was in a meeting at CSW last week where someone in frustration sort of threw up their papers and said, enough, stop talking, get acting. And I think that point of action, not words, is real. I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to, as I say, have met Keka and Victoria at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And there, the message every year is, okay, good, less words, more action. Let's see some progress. Governments can't just send delegations dominated by men for a week up in Scotland, talk about climate change, go home, and then continue as normal as if everything's changed. It's not achieving anything. So am I all right for time, Victoria? Sorry, I've just realized. So we have a member society in New Zealand, Rural Women New Zealand, and they really are demonstrating a gold standard approach of civil society and governmental collaboration. And they've really achieved significant progress and change in their own country by combining regular engagement with all levels of government, from tiny district councils up to the Prime Minister, and the use of international accountability processes, such as working with us to respond to the voluntary national reviews for New Zealand at the high-level political forum. And they're ensuring that their grassroots members are heard. And in the last 4 years, the New Zealand government has actually adopted not just a gender lens, but also a rural lens that have to be applied when developing all new policy initiatives. So now Rural Women New Zealand are consulted on every new policy and law in New Zealand to see its impact on rural women, which is an incredible achievement. And as far as I know, it's the only country that does it. So we've used, as you can tell by the fact that I'm a middle-class white man from the UK, we are very aware that being in the right place at the right time makes a massive difference. So we have used ACWW has used CSW 66 as an opportunity to platform Indigenous women and rural women from diverse communities and to amplify the voices of our members. I'm here today, as I was specifically asked, and we tried to put up other speakers. But on Friday last week, we hosted with the Canadian government a side event on rural economic empowerment and financial independence post-COVID-19. It included the participation of a Canadian government minister, Rural Women New Zealand, and Indigenous women from Canada and Turkey. But critically, the event identified not only positive examples of civil society cooperation and collaboration, but also pathways to action. And it resulted in a commitment from Canada to review progress ahead of next year's CSW, when rural women are the review theme, so that we can actually benchmark with disaggregated data and human experience, progress and failures that mark our progress on the road to the 2030 agenda. I think to finish, I'd just like to say, today is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the climate impacts of conflict can never be underestimated, but they're also exacerbated. And we note that obviously in Ukraine at the moment, there's a near global movement of political and emotional solidarity with the people in Ukraine that are suffering the effects and impacts of an illegal invasion. And we recognize that that's absolutely appropriate and totally reasonable. And but we also recognize that the attitudes of the West and global North states have not nearly been as sympathetic when those affected by conflicts in other regions have looked different. Refugees and IDPs fleeing conflicts in Africa and the Middle East continue to receive frosty receptions in most Western nations. And so we urge all governments to stand with those affected by conflict, regardless of their country of origin, their ethnic background or color. It's not good enough to say, well, these people look like us, so we'll take them in. That's just not acceptable in 2022. So I will probably leave it there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion later in the meeting.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yes, at DNOA, we stand in solidarity with Ukraine's people, and also, as you mentioned, for all people affected by the different and several wars that is happening around the world, and that we shouldn't forget. So thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for reminding us that all new policy initiatives should include not only a gender lens, but a rural lens when developed. And this makes a perfect transition to the presentation of our next panelist, Gabriel Tripura. Gabriel is the Executive Director of Kothawain, a member of the organization of the DNOA Network based in Bangladesh. Gabriel has been working on development for more than 19 years in the region. He belongs to the ethnic minority and indigenous community and serves for these communities on community livelihood development, human and indigenous rights, good governance, health and education, women's and children's empowerment, youth and adolescents, and climate change and emergency response. Gabriel will present the work at project they are doing with indigenous women on climate change and women's empowerment. So Gabriel, let me over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Victoria, first of all. You have guided a lot in preparing these documents. And also thank you to DNOA International, all members and all esteemed panelists, the other audience attending this. Thank you very much for and welcome into my presentation. Well, why the Kothawain is established? Because, Kothawain is a dialect language, my language. We are here living in the same place, 13 ethnic groups in the same place, and different language, different culture, different traditional, along with the mainstream community. I mean, the majority community, Bengali so-called. Kothawain, why established? Because still, this is very mountainous, my region, hilly and very inaccessible.
Gabriel, sorry, one question. Do you want me to share your presentation?
Oh, I can share here from here?
Yeah, sure. You can share.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. You can see? See the presentation? No.
No. You have to use the share screen button down below.
I don't know how to.
Okay. Let me see. I'll do it. And you tell me when to pass to the next slide. Okay. Can you see my
Okay.
screen, all of you?
Yeah.
Okay,
Very
perfect.
nice. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. The first slide so far is done. Second slides. Yeah. Yeah, but already I bit mentioned about my organization that it was established in 2003 with the with the young people who can do something for the communities. It is registered by the government, but still I need to another registration for foreign donations fund receipt. It is quite difficult for us for SA ethnic groups from my region because there is some political issues to get registration from the government for foreign donation receipts. I'm operating in my districts. We have 7 sub-districts and covering this. And already I have mentioned that the Kothain white, what is the Kothain meaning? This is in my language, hope for survival so far if I translate in English. Yeah. I have shown the map here. Where is the located? Yeah. Well, still, since this is very inaccessible and very remote places, the people are very under poverty and very low literacy. Mostly the parents, they're still illiterate. And the social and political conflict. I mean, this is mostly as an indigenous communities region. So the local indigenous groups and the mainstream people who have some bit conflict regarding the lands, regarding the rights issues, and also the eroding cultural identity, because as we have our own traditions, culture, dress, songs, beliefs and practice also, but somehow since due to the mainstream communities influence, we have also cultural identity issues, we have a big problem. Environmental degradation, because the now it was the forests are much becoming very deforestation. So we are now mostly right now this is very hot season, dry season. People are facing very much problem about the water, also wild foods, because indigenous mostly depend on the forests, lands and natural resources. And also high incidence with human rights and violations. Sometimes there is many rape case, also the women, I mean, the divorce, and also some women rights violations over there. And I have already mentioned about the indigenous groups, how many. So yeah. Next, please. Well, as an organization, we have some beliefs and a vision mission. So we mostly focus on the socio-economic development, promotion, empowerment amongst men and women. Mostly, we still determine how we can mostly collectively do for the women, and also mission to bring sustainable positive change by reducing poverty among the marginalized peoples, especially women and children, through participatory process by undertaking needs and rights-based development program in our region. Core values, participation stakeholders, because we need communities participation mostly, because all programs should be led by them. Justice for all, honesty, humanity, gender equality, transparency, accountability, environmental conservation, respect, and sharing skill and experience as well, because they have knowledge, they have skills, they have ideas, they have experience, but we need to share with the others people also as well. Yeah. Next, please. This is very important for the slides presentation. The project name is Indigenous Women's Role in Climate Change Mitigation. Indigenous women active participation on development initiatives ensuring their ownership, including climate change mitigation. I mean, this should be all the interventions, development programs should be ensure their ownership, so that they can sustain, they can do by their own way, even at the end of the project or after a phase of the project. The duration, it was started in 2014. Still, we have 2 years ahead. The project will be completed. Already, I have mentioned that the project location is namely Alikodam with the sub-districts. You can see the map, one of the sub-district in my district. It is supported by the Sona International. This is Austria-based organization. They have an office in the capital level. So there, we are doing collaboratively. Yeah. Beneficiaries: women, children, and youngs. All together, 1,460. They are the direct beneficiaries. Selection criteria: I mean, who are living very remote, mountain, backward, especially inaccessible areas, unserved, neglected, and deprived from the fundamental rights. Yeah. The project goal, strengthen indigenous women knowledge and traditional, customary, and practice through plantation, agriculture, basic health care, women rights, and community forest preservation, providing technical skills. I mean, since they are living in the remote places, forests, and also this is very important to strengthen their knowledge, because they have information, they have knowledge, but they needed technical supports. Provide literacy, adult education. I have mentioned already, they are mostly illiterate. I mean, they don't write, they don't know how to write, they don't know how to read. So we also, as a convergence program, so we also introduced them the literacy education program. Positive for their positive lifestyle changing, including productive professions and enhancement of livelihoods adapted to climate change. I mean, as they're living in the remote, the forest region, so they're very linked to the livelihoods as well, because they are fully dependent on the natural resources. Support disaster management and emergency preparedness, as natural disaster occur in that zone every year, by providing seasonal plan, fire, landslides, rescue materials and instruments. I mean, as a hilly mountainous region, this is very earthquake region, even sometimes due to burn suddenly the forest, so the fire got to the house and the village, so that's why they need the disaster management plan. I mean, sometimes accidentally died also people. So as a from the program, we supported them all these issues, so that they can protect and prevent all these disaster and pandemic and occurrence. Why women? Indigenous women are the main resources and contributor with fully participation in the program implementation and facilitation process. I mean, women, even we have information that out of the 24 hours, they works 70 to 18 hours, even every day, including the domestic works and others, along with the male. Group of mothers and women play a vital role in all aspects, including safety and security during disaster and pandemic. Even the COVID-19 also, they have a good role in the event following their traditional customary issues. They don't go out. They banned to entry from the outsiders. Even before that, they collected all the things from the foods so that they can stay at home safely. They maintain the whole domestic requirements and the management, including natural resources, through their indigenous knowledge, implications, and practice. Already I have mentioned a bit. Yeah. Impact and accomplishment. What we see the impact or result out of the after the through the programs. We found groups each and every villages. The total groups are 12 groups, so that the groups can sustain and take lead them even after the projects, because this is very important. If since this is a male-dominated society, they need to take lead the community, even the mostly the women and the children and the young girls. Women become self-reliant with their gained knowledge and capacity. I mean, since they receive many trainings and also guidance and facilitation, even a link up with the local stakeholders, so they are becoming very self-reliant. Even they can raise their voice. Women contributed to their husband in cultivating domestic gardening, water resources reserving, agriculture, pig rearing, poultry, others domestic works. So I have already mentioned that with the works, with the activities, they're spending the time 17 to 18 hours because of these workloads. Women are participating and executing the necessary activities on children and adult education program for increasing the literacy and higher education. You know, through the programs, we have now 50 to 60 students studying the higher education, even they are studying in capital level through the program supports. This is very important, and they are even sometimes they go to the village and they are motivating the parents even as well. So this is very important, because education is the only way to bring their positive change. Yeah, this is some photos, and yeah, and there you see the tupels. This is very rare because this is hilly, but only one I am trying to show the tupels, because some few villages are living in the plain land. They are making the IG, I mean the broom. This is very high demanded, even not only the community, it is also in the markets. Also, this is very high demanded brooms. So they are also the selling and earning the money. Before that, we have a meeting with the male also, because we needed the consent, we need the support from the male, so that they can do by their own way all those interventions and implement it. Thank you. Next. Through the programs, you know that the women declared and demonstrated enabling to apply and gain knowledge from receive training and sharing in promoting ecosystem diversity preservation, since they live in remote and hilly and forest areas. I mean, we don't have any markets, even the city, even the other modern technologies in the villages. So they are living in remote places, I mean in the forest, so they need to maintain everything, mostly the ecosystem also, because they need to rear the animal husbandry. Women showed and appointed their capacity more responsible for maintaining their entire house, support their children by empowerment and economically self-reliance. Since they are earning some money, so they are contributing to the economical development also to the husband. Women said their determination and performed efficiently in preserving their own indigenous culture. It is only way to recognize who are what, the indigenous, because male is now wearing the pants, so other modern dress, it is very difficult who are what. So women are the only the source of identity to identify their culture and the practice, traditions, beliefs, including women's rights through the program supports, implementation, and facilitation. So these are the even that they used to sit when the back from field. They used to sit in the evening time, and women are even now becoming very forward, playing the footballs and other traditional games, and even they perform the cultural dance when we go to the field and the village, and when we bring the high officials to them. Thank you. Challenges, yeah, still, since I have mentioned already that this is a very male-dominated society. Male domination and stronger power exercise that higher hinder women's free movement and participations. Even the during the pregnant, also during the some puberty or other, they needs to go to the market. They need to ask the permission. This is very pity. Because without their husband's supervision, they cannot go out even everywhere. Too much pressure on women from male towards domestic works and outside. You see, they need to collect the water, they need to collect the foods from forest, they need to maintain all the things. Even they need to prepare the beds also for sleeping for the people, male. Still, this is we need to look at it to improve for the improvement for them. Two risks and life threats for pregnant women in the culture and horticulture works, as it is situated high, hilly. You know, they need to climb the hills, mountains. You know, we have the profession slash and burning. I mean, this is annual production crops. So they need to climb hill, they need to climb mountain. So the pregnant women, mostly even the children, it's very risk to walk around. Local political insurgency situation and tourism makes them more insecure and unsafe. I mean, that since there is a conflict region, every time there is a fight in steel as well in some sporadic places. Even this is very becoming popular for the tourists. So this is also threats for the young girls. The tourist who comes here, they like the local foods, local drinks, even local made alcohol. So, but later it goes the worst situation to the women, because since they are poor, they want to influence something with the money and some other kinds. So this is very one of the threats also. I have some sort of the pictures that still there are many male, but women are only one that take lead to speak out. This is still, and you see the during the pandemic, the supports only women that carrying the goods, the food packets, but male are following without carrying anything. I just mentioned I have my photo is there also. I bring even the local police, even some local authorities, so that they can understand the situation. They can do something for the communities, even if anything faces the problems. So this is one of the linkage and motivating the also. Yeah. Sorry, maybe I am taking the time, Victoria. Lessons learned. The form groups of women for continuing the leadership. I have already some shared in the previous slides. The gain skills knowledge are in the place, easily accessible for all. The established of women rights and empowerment influence collectively more in society. The women-led program initiatives. All interventions are for the interest of women, inclusively in terms of leaving no one behind. So we are fully believe on that, and we must stick with The community common assets, properties, beliefs, traditional customary practices that ensure them live in stability and sustainability rather domestic groups. I mean, community still they are busy where the good forest, I mean the common forest, or where is the natural resources are available. So there is to run after that. So, but due to through these programs, so now become very stable and sustainable about their lifestyle. Women are still necessary to reach their voices to the local authority, because they need even to be elected in local elections, even some other higher position as well in all the services and departments. Amongst women need a good speaker, facilitator, leader, confident to communicate their needs and problems at local stakeholders and other concerned service providers. I mean, since they speak their own language, they need also learn the other language of the mainstream language, so that they can explain what they want to the right persons. The women physical daily labor wages, economic contributions is still discriminated and not equally considered with male. I mean that even the wages also, amounts of the money also very discriminated, not equally receiving like male. For any emergency and pandemic situation, women confront first as frontliner, but they need more for cooperation with necessary sufficient materials and instruments with guidelines. Then still supports, including the guidelines, so that they can fight against the pandemic, any pandemic. The women's skills and capacity is still limited within community, but it is badly required to support for wider benefits and profits. I mean, the women who are not included in the program, the other catchment areas and neighbor communities, they need to get supports like this, so that they can also contribute in the entire programs. Women are not entitled to ownership regarding all the necessary resources available and potentiality as male domination society. I mean that even the land, they are not entitled by name of them. Even if they divorced or somewhere they gone or died, the other, I mean the inheritance, they are not they don't get the ownership. So this is also very facing the problems to the women. Yeah. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know how much I can explain, but since I am working since many years, so but I can explain in one words, but I'm enjoying with the development works, and this is very important that we need to collaborate together. And mostly as a I'm living in hilly region and very under pressure and insecure, and also some limited. So we can do something if we can collaborate together. And I am highly requesting to all, so that we can have as a representative, as a humanitarian activists, we can work together and we can do something for the communities as well. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Maria Victoria, you're on mute.
Now that do you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I was saying that thank you, Gabriel, and that was very insightful, and your lived experience and the direct feedback that you have from of those women beneficiaries who work with you is very valuable. I'm very surprised that women are facing so many challenges in your region, not only the geographical situation in hilly remote areas, but also facing illiteracy, poverty, and worse than that, male domination. So that was, I really like the project that you are doing, and I think it can continue in the future. I think also that some elements that Gabriel has mentioned will come up in the next intervention from Taban Sherez. Taban is a former child genocide survivor and is the founder of the Lotus Flower, a nonprofit that supports female conflict survivors and refugees in Kurdistan, Iraq. With a political activist father during Saddam Hussein's regime, Taban was imprisoned with her family, aged just 4, and they narrowly escaped being buried alive. After living in London for many years, in April 2014, as Taban saw ISIS waging another genocide in her homeland, she returned to Kurdistan as an aid worker. And back in the UK, she launched the Lotus Flower in 2016. Taban, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Maria. I just wanted to check my headphones work because there's noises outside, so I've had to put it on. Okay, so thank you so much to Denova International for hosting this panel, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such great panelists. I'm Taban Sherez, CEO and founder of the Lotus Flower, and I'm here representing Giving Women, who are one of our valued supporters. The Lotus Flower supports women and girls impacted by conflict and displacement, and we implement projects through our centres in refugee camps through 3 pillars, which is education, livelihoods, peace building and human rights, and health and safety. Giving Women is a membership association which seeks to build a community of informed women philanthropists and to make meaningful difference in the lives of girls and women in need all over the world. So what does a holistic approach to gender and climate change look like? Climate change is an urgent and devastating problem that we face today, and one that can't be ignored. Amongst other things, it is and will exacerbate inequalities, the impact on women and girls, conflict and displacement. It is predicted that there will be 200 million climate refugees by 2050, with women bearing the brunt of climate change and its impact on physical health, livelihoods, food security, and gender-based violence. But we can't address climate change or meet any climate goals without women. The international community was slow to address the relationship between gender and climate change. Historically, scientists, researchers, and policymakers struggled to make the vital connections between gender and climate change. This was made harder with a remarkable imbalance of women representation in rooms full of men who are making decisions, often without the input of women. Now, with more research and data, it's evident and clear that the correlation between climate change and gender is there. It's time to talk about the disproportionate impact of climate change and the link of women's empowerment being the effective solution to climate action. While women and girls experience disproportionate impacts from climate change at the global level, we need to remember that the effects are not uniform. Various forms of inequality often operate and exacerbate each other. It's clear that climate change risks are felt more deeply for Indigenous women, women and girls of colour, older women, women and girls with disabilities, migrant and refugee women and girls, and those living in rural, remote, conflict and disaster-prone areas. So some examples of how women and girls are impacted by climate change. For some parts of the world, climate change makes life feel, I'd say, a little bit more complicated, so the weather might be a little bit more cold or hot. But for others, it's really a matter of life and death. Flooding. For example, flooding in parts of the world results in more dead bodies of women and girls being pulled out of the water simply because they were never taught to swim. Droughts. In low and medium income countries and rural communities, women lead agriculture and have the responsibility of securing food, water, and fuel. The impact of droughts lead to poor livelihoods and undermines food, water, fuel security. As a result, women and girls are forced to collect food and water and fuel further away. the pressure on girls is often made them leave school and education to help their mothers. There's also the problem of the threat multiplier that we need to consider. Climate change is a threat multiplier, which means it escalates social, political, and economic tensions in fragile and conflict settings. For example, water scarcity and food shortages caused by drought and floods impact the movement of people, forcing them to flee in already inhabited lands, which can trigger conflicts. As a result, women and girls face increased vulnerabilities to all forms of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, human trafficking, child marriage, and other forms of violence. Gender inequalities. Due to long-standing gender inequalities that created the disparities in information, training, mobility, decision-making, and access to resources, women are less likely to survive should a disaster happen. Furthermore, women and girls are less likely to access relief and assistance, which threatens their livelihoods, well-being, and recovery, creating a vicious cycle of vulnerabilities. Health. Climate change impacts the health of women and girls, limiting their access to vital services and healthcare. It increases the risk of maternal and child health. For example, extreme heat increases incidence of stillbirth and increasing the spread of vector-borne illnesses such as malaria, Zika virus, and dengue fever. We need to remember women are not the only victims of climate change, but also the solution. Over the years, we've seen the incorporation of gender in the decisions and in mandates. Women have led the international community to create a more gender-responsive climate policies. Women play a huge role in change and in the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also in programs that minimize damage. In fact, they have been at the forefront. We've seen Indigenous women continue to be at the front line of climate protest against fossil fuel extraction. We've seen young girls around the world inspiring youth to take strikes and activism. We've seen women inventing technologies, deploying agriculture practices, building zero waste business models, managing renewable energy and water and conservation action. What do we need to do more of to keep women and girls at the forefront of the solutions of climate change? Well, educating girls. Around 130 million girls are still denied the basic right to attend school. Gaps are greatest in secondary age. Education means better health, financial security, and agency at home and in their community. It also gives girls more ability to navigate the climate changing world. Educating communities. In some countries, the concept of climate change doesn't even exist at grassroots level. Problems such as poverty, conflict, and instability are more prevalent in their lives, and therefore focus will not be on climate change. For example, in the region that we work in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, which has faced many years of conflict, climate change has never been the focus or importance. Yet they're facing the impact of climate change, from droughts caused by low rainfall to wildfires and plastic pollution. Taking this into consideration, starting capacity building programs through education and advocacy is needed to mobilize communities. It's for this reason we're implementing a project called Earth Sisters with the aim of raising awareness around climate change and its impact on the community and the need to work together to prevent escalation of problems. Livelihoods. Women are primary farmers around the world, but have less opportunity, access, and rights compared to men. If we decrease this gap, farm yields would rise globally, which means a decrease in deforestation and will help sustain our forests. Our Farming Sisters program ensures women are given the tools and opportunities they need to lead in the expertise in their community. Health. It's critical for women and girls to have access to high quality voluntary reproductive health care. Around 45% of women in lower economy countries want to decide whether to become pregnant and when. They want to have access to contraception. Not only is this their right, but it also curbs the growth of human population. This could dramatically reduce the demand for so many things such as food, energy, and as well as reducing emissions. Mental health. We can't forget the importance of mental health. Through our work, we know that for women to be engaged and fully present in other activities, we have to help them rebuild their internal and emotional mental strength. This gives them agency not just within themselves, but also in their communities. Leadership. Women are vital voices and agents for climate change, and a holistic approach needed to make a greater impact. We need more women in leadership roles and decision-making rooms. We need to ensure voices from grassroots levels are not left out. Listening to including women leaders from local communities is crucial. We have a program called Peace Sisters that enables women to become mediators and points of contact for people in the community, for any threat multipliers or disasters that arise in the community. Action. It's great that we're seeing more research, more data, more fact sheets on women and climate change, but in reality, more action and projects are needed to be implemented on the ground for change to happen. We don't really have enough time and we need to act now. Collective mobilization. Yes, women provide great solutions to climate change, but it's important to remember it's not all on our shoulders. We need to work collectively and holistically to ensure climate goals are met. Funding. The problem we currently face are many, but one of the largest of them all is that only 0.2% of global funding is specifically for women and environment. That's a mere $110 million globally. If you want to see women lead climate change, more funding is needed to make that a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Taban. Really very important points as we have touched, and we really appreciate your inputs on the link between gender, climate change, and conflicts, and the need for more funding. And unfortunately, the long-term effects of climate change clearly also impact organizations and their ability to provide services. The situation is even worse for organizations operating in regions whose reliance on the oil, gas, and gas industry hinders progress on environmental policies. To discuss the critical elements that are missing to mitigate those effects as climate change intensifies, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Edward Carlson, Chief Executive Officer of Odyssey House Louisiana. Since January 2005, Edward has expanded OHL from a small singular treatment program to a multi-program social service continuum of care, growing OHL into the largest and most comprehensive substance abuse treatment facility in Louisiana. Edward has been responsible for the implementation and operation of over 39 treatment programs over his career and is a dedicated advocate for the substance abuse field. Ed, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate kind remarks. And also, I'm very impressed with all the panelists and the information and the work that you all are doing. You know, I'm very humbled to be on such a great panel with such great people. I need the ability to share my screen. Am I cleared to do that? All right. Let me do this. I'm going to apologize for my technical capabilities here. Can you guys see me?
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. And so now let us start.
Yes.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe take the change and the conversation a little bit different from actually what we have to do with dealing with in the middle of a disaster and how we're trying to provide services. And then I'm going to tie it all back into how it connects specifically with women and children's services in Louisiana. So, so these are some of the challenges that we're dealing with, specifically as a drug and alcohol treatment in an environment and emergency. As was mentioned, we are also a very oil and oil industry located area here in Louisiana. And so lots of times anything related to climate change and issues related to climate change fall on deaf ears. So Odyssey House, Louisiana, located notoriously below sea level in New Orleans, Louisiana, the long-term effects of climate change and disaster risk management are increasingly evident, as for 2 consecutive years, Odyssey House's programs have been vastly impacted by major Category 4 hurricanes, which directly impacts our ability to provide services. This presentation will explore OHL's experience and environmental disaster influenced by climate change, its disaster management, and discuss the critical elements that are missing to mitigate these issues as climate change intensifies. The presentation will also touch on how women are uniquely impacted by climate change related disasters and how systems are not in place to address these needs. So just to give you a little background about Odyssey House, we're a nonprofit behavioral healthcare facility with an emphasis on addiction treatment. We were established in 1973. We offer comprehensive services and effective support systems, focusing on treatment for addiction to substances and alcohol, including prevention. We also include doing prevention, residential treatment, physical and mental health care, life skills and vocational training, housing, counseling, and case management that enable individuals to chart new lives and return to their communities as contributing members. Odyssey House also, we offer medically supported detox, residential inpatient treatment, and we operate two what we call here federally qualified health centers that provide vital primary medical care services regardless of ability to pay to thousands of individuals each year. Our encompassing continuum of care includes multiple levels of treatment that can address the clients at their individual level of need. Today, the wider scope and mission of Odyssey House operations provides services to over 1,500 people a month. So let's talk about Hurricane Katrina. So I happened to go through Hurricane Katrina. I had just taken over Odyssey House about 6 months before Hurricane Katrina had hit New Orleans. This picture here is me taking a boat to get to our main facility to check on it about a week after the hurricane had hit New Orleans. And so you can see the amount of water and damage that was done to our building. It was a Category 3 at landfall, and it was the costliest hurricane in US history. 80% of New Orleans was underwater. So just to give you an idea, pre and post disaster, we had to evacuate 58 clients from our residential inpatient program. We were able to get them all out. All staff were evacuated and got out of the area before the hurricane hit. We had over 2.7 million in facility damage due to wind and water and vandalism. We had to, in order for us to get reopened, because we couldn't find people to do work, we utilized volunteers from treatment programs around the country. We reopened our doors 10 weeks after the storm, and individuals starting to show up at Odyssey House's doorstep. Oddly enough, they weren't seeking addiction treatment. They had other needs. And this also include everybody from lots of people in the local community, and people had a lot of needs who were not able to get out during the storm. Instead, residents of mainly our lower income neighborhoods surrounding OHL asking for food, water, and medical assistance. And so we had to change our mission all of a sudden to help deal with the issues that were presented to people right away. Recognizing the community need, in January 2006, a mere 2 months after the facility reopened from Katrina, we began hosting a free medical clinic for people in the New Orleans community. We also joined the Katrina Aid Today Consortium, assisting hurricane survivors in identifying sources of support, developing personal recovery plans, and acquiring access to services and taking appropriate action to become self-sufficient once again. Odyssey House participated in the Federal Disaster Housing Assistance Program to transition hurricane affected households into stable and permanent market rate housing. So then after Hurricane Katrina, it was like every year we felt like we were getting a near miss, and another one would come, and the amount of stress every time a hurricane was forming in the Gulf of Mexico became very evident between our staff and all the people and our clients and the people in our community. And we dodged quite a few bullets up until 2020, and then all of a sudden we had a series of hurricanes hitting us. And then we had Hurricane Laura, which was a Category 4, tied for the most powerful storm in US at landfall. And it hit mainly in a rural area, the Lake Charles area, where we have programs. So we evacuated our 25 clients during a mandatory evacuation, over 1 million in losses with facility damage and loss of revenue, extensive damage to the facilities, an extreme lack of resources in more rural areas of the state, forced a 10-month closure of our program. Our challenge is OHL had taken ownership of this program slightly over a year prior to the storm, and Hurricane Laura hit a less populated area of the state, compared to New Orleans, and therefore received less public attention and federal aid. It was amazing, and even though the storm was as damaging as Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot less focus, a lot less, and it seemed that it took very quickly for most of the society to forget what had happened. Then 1 year later, Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans as a direct hit, Category 4, and it was the 5th costliest storm in US history. And so pre-disaster was interesting because normally what tends to happen is the local government will put a mandatory evacuation. And because of the shifting of the hurricane, there was no mandatory evacuation. So myself and staff, we had to hunker down with over 200 clients, had nowhere to go because of the storm. And so we had some newer buildings that we consolidated everybody to. Some of the pictures here for our residential inpatient detox program was heavily hit and damaged because of the storm. And in fact, it's still closed today as we're still working out issues related to insurance and getting the program repaired and fixed. So some of the effects of climate change related to disasters and substance use disorder. And I'm sure that a lot of people really could understand and relate to this, that as you're going through a traumatic experience, one of the subsequent things that winds up happening from this is that people wind up having a real problem specifically related to using substances, alcohol and or other drugs as a way of sort of being able to manage it. You have your immediate and practical concerns, which has to do with water, food, gas, trying to be able to sort of survive and get access to things that you need. And economic problems, because if you don't have money and resources, in Louisiana, we have a very large, poor and impoverished groups of people who really had no resources or anything to be able to have to deal with some of the immediate and practical concerns from a hurricane. Then the long-term concerns have to do with grief and anger, emotional pain, also the feelings of being trapped in poverty and lacking economic opportunity. Also people separating from post-traumatic stress disorder, because the moment this all happens again, it brings up all the problems. So you have depression, anger, you have people being very, almost losing the ability to be able to make basic decisions on what they need to do. So some of the documented effects. So for example, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention studying compared pre-Katrina and post-Katrina rates of hospitalization. We had a 35% increase of hospitalization related to specifically addiction, alcohol and drugs. We had a 185% increase in alcohol consumption after Hurricane Katrina. This is just phenomenal in terms of the amount of alcohol and other substances that were being abused after Hurricane Katrina. And then we saw the long-term after effects in terms of the addiction, the population, and so 45% increase in the need for requests for services related to mental health and substance use. It was interesting because there were, after Hurricane Laura had hit the area that was really heavily damaged, the group that helps to manage mental health and substance abuse issues was unable to provide any services at all. And they had 8,000 requests for assistance and had no resources available. So some of our challenges, we have pre-storm challenges. So we're trying to always be prepared for, and every year when hurricane season comes around, starting at the beginning of June, we have to start to be prepared. Louisiana, our problem is water. We have too much water. We have too much water coming down the Mississippi. We have too much water coming from the Gulf of Mexico. We have too much water coming from rain. So we're already saturated before a major category storm comes to hit us. And we've been losing our coastline at the rate of 1 football field a day for the last 15 years. And the amount of land that is disappearing is only going to make us more and more vulnerable. So we're worried about during the storm, client staff safety. Everything breaks down, lack of communication, how to mitigate damages of your facilities when you're in the middle of a storm. Post-storm is lack of critical necessities. If we evacuated, people returning to work. If not evacuated, managing expectations of staff and people on site and how to keep things operational. And then a lot of our brother and sister programs around smaller facilities, they had to close completely, which left a larger burden on us. And then the aftermath, this post-traumatic stress disorder, increasing uses of leads to intensifying need for services, long-term effects, strained staff, diminished resources, and long-term damages to facility. So how can we be more prepared? And the honest answer is we don't know, right? There's always the unknown, storms, the different capacities, whether they're coming to us or not. There's a lot of sympathy fatigue. I mean, people are kind of like, why do you live in a city that's below sea level? We hear this on the federal government all the time. Why rebuild and why should we spend resources and money in a city that, you know, we've already have put money and resources in? And then we have ongoing stigma, specifically related to substance use disorders. And there's sort of a lack of investment on the front end to continue, to help us out to deal with these issues around stigma and the problems associated. And then the effects on women. So I gave you sort of a broader picture overall, and we do a lot of services for women in the community. We also do a lot of advocacy work for women and the need for gender-specific services. We do a lot of gender-specific services, and we really focus on trying to make a good and comfortable place for women and the services that they need. But we know that poverty and the connection with drugs and alcohol, with poverty in our community, has the biggest impact on women, and specifically women with children. You know, and during a disaster, there's no childcare. You know, they still need to assume a lead role as the caregiver. Financial inequalities, you know, with unequal pay, women face larger financial burdens, unmet basic needs, you know, during a storm. So lack of access to diapers, formula, tampons, etc., even access to food. And oddly enough, through a hurricane, once the hurricane hits, you could get drugs and alcohol pretty easy, but you might not be able to get any access to food, which is ridiculously crazy. Unique medical needs, you know, access to gender-specific medical care is limited. And then there's no representation. You know, we're not really reaching out to find out what the needs are for women in our communities and how we could better be able to advocate for them and for their services and being able to make policy decisions. They're not at the table. And there's a lot of barriers to treatment that are exacerbated by climate change and related disasters. So women are some of the most vulnerable populations, especially the women that are connected are sort of trapped in poverty and the cycles around addiction that are specifically connected with it. So mitigating the inevitable, you know, natural disasters are inevitable. This is the reality. This is the new world that we live in. There's an intensity that only increases as the effects of climate change become more apparent. I live in a region and a place that's weather-related vulnerabilities, has its own unique challenges, but we also feel a responsibility to work with the high risk and underserved communities to provide services, especially in the midst and aftermath of an environmental crisis. So we got to fight today for a better tomorrow. This is what we need to do. We need to do advocacy. We need to educate people. I'm very involved in our statewide provider association. I'm also president of our national association, and we spend a lot of time doing advocacy and working and trying to make sure that our elected officials understand what the needs are. So, like I said, help promote change, be an advocate, right? Fight the stigma and support treatment, and don't give up. I'm an eternal optimist. I don't care how bad it is out there or how bad the hurricane is or how bad the problems are associated. We can still make the change and we can still help the people in our community. And that's the end of my presentation. And thank you all very much for including me. And I really appreciate everything that you all are doing. Thank you. And done.
Thank you, Ed, for your presentation and for explaining us the connections between climate disasters and drug addictions, and for bringing to the table our responsibility as advocates to help promote change and not to give up. Now is the time for our audience to have their questions and comments addressed, and I would like to invite the panelists to jump and respond to them as you may fit. So I have first a question for Keka. If you can expand a little bit of what is ecofeminism.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So for us, how we see ecofeminism and how that relates to feminist climate justice, once again, it is really about understanding the interlinkages between gender equality, women's role in leading the movement for nature conservation, and recognizing how integral it is women empowerment is towards in the environmental movement as well, and just recognizing that connection, because women and girls forever really have been the bearers of knowledge of seeds, of cooking, of home, of fishing, and we've seen that in the communities that we work in, and that in itself is why it's so important to adopt an ecofeminist lens where we understand how intrinsically women and nature are related. And once again, as I mentioned, it's about recognizing women as not just the victims, but as the leaders of bringing about change globally and ensuring that our planet is green and sustainable.
Thank you, Keka. Thank you for the explanation. Nick, I think I was very struck about the role of women in the transition to net zero societies. And I don't know about that. I'd like you to explain a little more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I do, can I just echo Keka-chan's point about, we use language like marginalized and vulnerable. And both of those are generally, you can only be marginalized or vulnerable if someone has made you marginalized and vulnerable. And so I think we have to be, when we're looking for systematic change, we have to also look for a change and a shift in language, which reflects the positive and the reality that we seek to be achieving, rather than just maintaining status quo and upgrading someone. In terms of the net zero economies, the reality is that climate smart agriculture and so many of the shifts that are happening in rural communities globally, whether it's switching to solar cookers, whether it's switching to the reliance on local seeds, indigenous seeds, seed banking, seed libraries, and movement away from kind of corporate controlled agriculture, are being led by women in rural communities. And the shift, the reality of climate change that is being seen on the ground on a daily basis means that women in those communities are far more likely to be adopting solutions, because they are actually looking at a holistic picture rather than just, my crops aren't doing well this year, that's going to mean I earn less money. Well, it's the women in those communities who say, okay, well, if we're earning less money, that puts everything else in a more vulnerable situation. And it means there's going to be, I'm going to have to do this, 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 and this. So those initiatives are coming. I was interested, in Gabriel's presentation. ACWW has done a lot with women in Dalit communities in India and in Bangladesh. And the work we have done has generally focused on empowerment and education, but generally agricultural empowerment and education and financial independence that comes with that. So the reduction of climate impact in agriculture is being led by women already.
Thank you, Nick, for your explanation, and thank you also for making us aware of the languages and the words that we use every day. And in your presentation, I took notice that we can't use kind of say freely women as agents of change, and I will remind that for my next presentation or even parallel event.
I think sorry, just to come
yes,
back, I think we can use it, but we have to be aware of the implications of our language. That is an expectation of expecting change to come from people who are fundamentally being removed from the structures that allow change.
Yeah, and not only that, it's like listening to you and Gabriel and Taban and Edward, is that women are suffering so much around the world, so many things, geographical conditions, poverty, lack of education, and then we expect or we ask them to be the agents of change or come up with solution. And I think that's maybe it's too much that we are asking, even though they of course they must be part of the solution and the solution must come from them, but it's I don't see myself living in that condition, and it starts giving me the time to think, okay, how can I change this?
Can I chip into that?
Of course.
Because we do use, I completely understand why you shouldn't use it, but it's something sometimes we do use. And the women and girls that we work in are in communities which are very conservative. They have, I'd say, zero voice in their communities amongst the men. And we do provide platforms, tools, and opportunities to allow them to be trained to be agents of change. And actually, Peace Sisters is a great example of that. We've taken women and girls who have zero understanding of mediation, peace, to be within that community. The training that we've provided have actually made them leaders in that community. So they've become agents of change. They might not have known it before. We don't expect them to be the only agents of change, and we kind of realize that, and that's why we develop programs which are very holistic. For example, even though we support women and girls predominantly, we also have programs for men and boys. We implement men and boys trauma programs, which are very successful and very I'd say something that's not focused on by other organizations, and something that needs to be focused on, because the problems that the women and girls face that we work with actually is rooted from the way men and boys see them. So we've included them in our programs to try and make that change happen. In addition to that, we've implemented projects like positive masculinity. Now, trying to train men and boys on how to look at themselves and view women and girls in a particular way in a society that is extremely conservative is very difficult. But we've realized actually bringing them in as agents and giving them that power and saying, actually, you can help us along the way by making this happen, and including the women. We've seen great examples of success. And I understand what you say when you say don't use it as agents of change, but in the practices that we've seen practically as projects on the ground, we've seen a massive improvement and sense of great agency. I mean, there I am, I'm using it again, but they have become leaders in their community, and we've seen that shift. We've seen that shift in how they're viewed in the community. So I'd say as a women's organization, that's why we most probably do use it at times.
Thank you, Taban, for jumping in. And I'm sure that Gabriel in Bangladesh also faces these challenges, like implementing projects for women and to empower them that are facing a very conservative society. So Gabriel, I know that you've faced a lot of restraints and cut of funding because of COVID. And I'd like you of the work, amazing work that you have done in Bangladesh. What happens with, for a crisis like the COVID, you stop getting funding? What do you do? How do you see the future, that the work that you're doing?
Well, yeah, very good question. Also, this is mainly, we feel that the question, the issues. We are living very adjacent to the world largest refugee camp also. I even worked for refugee when they entrenched in the earlier. We are very closer to the largest refugee camps. This is also one of the big issues for us, because they can enter very easily in our areas, and they are mostly like indigenous like this, because they can do everything. I mean, they look Bengali, but their profession and they're very arrogant. So this is one of them. But the funding issues due to COVID and the refugee scams also. So we are facing the funding problems, even since actually for doing the community project, community works, we don't need much very large funding scale as well, because we can we only if we can get small grants even, we can do many things with the communities. I don't know how much, I mean, it's a very relevant proposal, I don't know, but since Dynamo International has a lot of connectivity, if they can raise the issues to other places, also other benevolent institution persons also. It may be very small amount, but it may help a lot to the communities. So this is very, I want to say through the programs as well. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriel. And also going back to Taban, I was intrigued about from your experience working with women displaced because of conflict, that they might not be aware of the climate change. So how do you deal with that in that situation, the very difficult situation? How do you educate or inform them about climate change and what actions to take?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, in some societies and communities, climate change doesn't even exist, like the words, the thought, purely because so many other things in their life are more prevalent. So for example, with the women and girls that we work with, they are survivors of, I'd say, ongoing conflict. Not only are they survivors of the recent ISIS conflict, but our region has been in conflict from the moment I was born and as long as I can remember. And so they've never had to kind of look at any other issues apart from surviving and within the context of conflict and the traumas that brings. So for us, the way that we try and bring in, and we're starting to bring in climate change and the impact of climate change, is by making it very localized and relatable for them. For example, around the camps, you will not believe the amount of plastic pollution there is, and it's just piling up and piling up and piling up. For example, in summer, it becomes extremely heated, and then sudden wildfires start happening. And these wildfires extend out into the camps, which cause camps to actually, half tents to be burnt down. So the way that we approach it is to make it really relatable and localized to the community for them to understand. And so I think that's why it's very important for us at that level, at the grassroots level, to start with education and advocacy and start helping them understand through capacity building what the impact of climate change is. What is climate change? What impact is it having locally? And what can we do as a society or a community or individually to take a step towards that? It's a very, very new concept, a bit like taking positive masculinity to Kurdistan. It's a very, very new concept. And so we have to work within the grain of the society that we're working in and understand what problems they face. And actually, the reason why we would have more support in doing that and acceptance in doing that is because we help them through the other programs. We help them through livelihood programs. We help them through education. We help them through mental health. So we do the holistic approach. We're not just coming in to say, hey, you need to do climate change and support us and meet these goals. We're actually doing everything else holistically. We've gained their support and trust, and now we're bringing in a new element, and that makes it easier for us to bring in new elements for support.
Thank you, Taban. Thank you. And related to that, I'd like to ask Edward, how do people on treatment express concern over climate change? Is there any difference between men and women? How they react in the treatments when there is climate change situation?
Well, I think it won't actually, it was very interesting kind of going through the last hurricane, hunkering down with a lot of clients, with a lot of discussion about the problems associated with climate change and its impact on New Orleans. Sorry about the noise in the background. But I do find that there's actually probably more concerns from women than men. And I do find that from my interactions that they feel much more concerned because they feel much more vulnerable by what's happening and the impact on climate change is having on us. And we could just sort of see the real happening every day here in New Orleans and on the Louisiana coast, and how much we're losing of our coastline all the time, and being below sea level makes us very vulnerable all the time. And we've had just even heavy rains that have caused problems, shutting down and turning off power and losing ability to be able to get around town because of that, and flooding associated with it. So so the short answer is yes, and that people are talking about it a lot more here than they were just even like 5 or 6 years ago, and that there's a lot more concern. But what I'm seeing is more of a concern from women than it is from men, because there's also sort of a fine line, because we're such a huge oil and gas industry, and a large chunk of our state revenue is contributing to oil and gas, and is from oil and gas. And so because of the amount that we produce here from the Gulf of Mexico, it's hard sort of even bringing anything up in the state legislature around it, because everyone doesn't want to take away the economic money that, and the jobs associated with it. But at some point we have to start coming to Jesus a little bit more with where we are in terms of the reality of what's happening around us. I kind of like a lot of people walking around basically blindfolded, pretending that it's not a problem, and it's kind of disheartening.
Thank you so much. And we have another question in the chat box, is that if any of the speakers can speak a little bit of the traditional knowledge held in communities to mitigate climate disasters and earth regeneration programs. I don't know, Keka or Gabriel or even Taban, if you have any.
Maybe, well, we the people, we do the community forest, common forest. Because we need to collect the water, we need to collect the foods, we need to collect the even the bamboo, the trees. It's made for building house. Now the local businessman, the middleman, other who are doing the business for money and others. So they are cutting down everything. So because of that, now we are getting very heat. We don't have water, we don't have the stone, we don't have the trees, we don't have the other wild foods. So it's an impact to the communities. Even it's a made event, even we don't get the much oxygen as well now. So we have knowledge of how to preserve the community common forest, but due to the influence and the other surrounding problems. So this is one of the threats and challenges as well.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think that also I see that it must be very, very challenging. Keka, I don't know if you wanted to add something. Please.
I did, yeah, absolutely. All of the communities that we work in, especially those that are rural, indigenous, we see that, as I was mentioning earlier, that the knowledge of the women possess, mostly passed down through orally, that it's just so amazing. And for us as Green Hope Foundation, all of our members and ambassadors are from those very communities, are mostly women and girls from those very communities. And for us, that's really important, because we understand that it's not about us coming in from the outside and changing things. It's about change coming from within and driven by the people of that society. And that is why it's so important for us to understand and that localized knowledge and the traditional indigenous knowledge that has been there for a very long time, but possessed by the women and girls, but often ignored because of, well, this is heteropatriarchy. So yes, absolutely, we use that in all of our programs, and that is why, our work is so localized in different parts of the world, because we use traditional indigenous knowledge that's unique to that particular community, not just like, all over the country, but to that very particular community.
Yeah, in fact, localizing the project is one of the key success to the project itself. Nick, I think you wanted to add something.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was going to add, I would certainly never seek to speak on behalf of Indigenous women or for Indigenous women, but what I would say from the meetings that we've had in the last week with Indigenous speakers from various communities around the world has been that there is an assumption from probably at the governmental level and certainly in the West, that everybody wants to live within the standardized, accepted, capitalist Western ideal. And, you know, so often in the communities we're working with, women are saying, we're not actually seeking what you may assume we're seeking. So that point of a localized, relevant knowledge and traditional knowledge is really critical, because what works somewhere isn't going to work somewhere else. And they are the people who are going to know that immediately. You know, so statisticians and government agencies can come in and say, oh, well, this worked here, we can transplant it. Well, that may not be the case. And it may be the case. You know, there is no one answer. And just to pick up on, not to go back too far, but just to pick up on the previous point, Taban, I think you're absolutely right. And I think your point about agents for change is exactly why I did say, you know, it can be used if taken in the way that you are doing. My concern is that when it is put in as text into treaties, it shifts the dynamic into being a burden rather than being a genuine opportunity, because I think the work that you're doing, you know, is clearly fantastic and absolutely the right approach. So I just wanted to clarify, I wasn't against the terminology, I was just against it being codified too unkindly.
Thank you, Nick, for the clarification. And Taban, do you want to add something, please?
No, thank you, Nick, for the clarification. That's, yeah, I think we it's the same for us. And in terms of the local knowledge, 100%, we believe in the local knowledge, and any project that we implement is completely led by the local knowledge. So we work with our women and girls to implement projects. We don't come up with a project and say, hey, let's see if this works. It's more working with them and their knowledge, and actually they hold the knowledge. I would add to that, what's needed is the support and the backing and the funding to make local implementers powerful in their changes. You can't make any of the changes, you can't implement any of the projects without the support. You know, we might have an international registration, but actually we're local implementers, and we see the dynamic of, you know, 200 local organizations fighting for a £50,000 donation from a bigger organization. That can't happen. More funding needs to go to local organizations to implement projects to make real change happen. I think it's great that we've got lots of discussions and we've got lots of research and we've got all these treaties and mandates and so on. It's amazing, but nothing's really going to happen if we don't implement it on the ground, and that's not going to happen without funding.
Thank you, Taban, you're right. And the final question I'd ask to ask Ed, your experience, if you can share something about your experience working with Black American communities in Louisiana specifically.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the African American community is very heavily impacted by poverty and addiction issues. But interestingly enough, our population that we receive in work into treatment tends to be like 50% African American and 50% Caucasian. So a lot of people would assume that it would be higher on the African American side, but it's actually about 50%. Addiction doesn't know anything about race, and it definitely crosses across it. And so does mental health and other issues that are related to it. But we have a lot of specific programs that we work at with trying to reach out to the African American population and really try to make them be able to connect with the need and the services that are available. We do a lot of grants. We've had a lot of grants in the past that have helped us as an organization to make sure. We also do make sure that our population, our staff reflects our population. So in terms of women and people of color and men, and also people from the LGBTQ community who work, you know, so we try to make sure that the work that we do reflects the population, that our staff reflect the population that we do the work with. And we do a lot of outreach. We have a large prevention and outreach department that does a lot of work out in the community to help to educate people about overdose prevention is one of our big things. So we give out a lot of medications to help with overdose prevention. Because the opioid epidemic has been so bad here, specifically in New Orleans and Louisiana area, to try to help save people's lives that are associated with that.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for the work, amazing work that you're doing. And this has been such an extraordinary panel, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I'd like to go back to our panelists and ask each of them for their takeaways in just 30 seconds or at most 1 minute in reverse order of the previous presentation. So it would go like Ed, Taban, Gabriel, Nick, and Keka. In your opinion, what are the ideas to be remembered from this conversation?
So I would say advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And we need to start working to make sure that people with whatever country you're in and also on the international level, make sure that they understand the needs associated for women in particular and the impact that climate change is having on them.
I would say working with the Indigenous groups and local organizations and really taking in their knowledge and fully supporting them and backing them to implement any projects that they feel is needed within that community.
Gabriel? Gabriel, it's your turn. Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry. Thank you very much again. This is, the right platform to raise the issues, and even what we feel the concern that we can do, I think, something collectively for the betterment of the communities, what we feel the threats and the challenges for the future. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I think I'm next. I think we've spoken a lot about systemic change and governments and the kind of very high level, funding and political and policy change. And I think that's often challenging for people who are in meetings like this to connect with. So I think I would just say, change something, go off with the rest of your day or tomorrow morning or whatever it is, wherever your time zone is, and change something, whether it's a daily action or a practice or a system at work or a policy or a habit or even a hobby. Take some kind of positive action to help address systematic issues that are around you and the barriers that you see as blocking success in positive change and progress towards the 2030 agenda. Just whatever it is, whether it ties into Ed's work or Edward's work or Taban's work or whatever. Just do something active to make a difference today.
I think I am next. Okay, so this has been such a wonderful discussion, and I just would like to reiterate that for millions of girls and women, the livelihoods and income sources, they are deeply intertwined with natural resources that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. And what we need to remember is that women and girls in all of our diversity, we face unique challenges depending on where we are, based on various social determinants. So given the wide range of gender issues and inequalities that are impacted by climate change, when we look towards towards implementing climate justice, all of these climate justice efforts need to challenge these stereotypes that limit opportunities for girls and women, and remember to always adopt an intersectional lens that really takes into account their unique challenges and implement unique solutions thereafter.
This has been such an enlightening event, and I hope it has been for the audience. Once again, thank you so much to our wonderful speakers for being here with us today, sharing their invaluable knowledge and expertise. Thank you to the audience for choosing us among the hundreds of parallel events to CSW 66 that are happening this week. Also, thank you to NGO CSW for organizing the civil society side of the Commission on the Status of Women of the United Nations and giving so many organizations a platform for our voices to be heard. And last but not least, thank you to my colleagues of the ANOVA that are behind the scenes for the kind support. And I hope to see you all next CSW 67 in the next year. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for being with us here today. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah.